The avoidant would say things to you right now if they were not too proud to admit the truth that their defensive patterns prevent them from ever actually saying, would confess realities their wounds require them to hide behind defensiveness and blame and emotional unavailability, would acknowledge what their pride makes impossible to acknowledge, even though some part of them knows exactly what they are doing and exactly what they destroyed, and exactly how much you deserved better than what their terror allowed them to give. The things they would say if pride did not prevent saying reveal that they know more than their behavior suggests they know, understand more than their patterns demonstrate they understand, recognize more than their defensiveness allows them to recognize out loud or even fully to themselves. The admissions they would make if not too proud reveal that the person who hurt you was not unconscious of hurting you, but was conscious enough to know hurt was happening, while being too terrified or defended or committed to protecting themselves to stop hurting you. That the person who withdrew from intimacy knew intimacy was what you needed and what they were denying, even as they claimed not to understand what you wanted. That the person who blamed you for their patterns knew at some level that patterns were theirs, and blame was deflection, even while insisting you were problem. The self-awareness exists behind the defenses, even when defenses prevent self-awareness from translating into changed behavior or honest admission or accountability for damage caused. Understanding what they would say if not too proud to admit, it reveals that their defensiveness is not evidence they do not know, but is evidence they cannot face knowing. That their blame is not proof they believe blame, but is protection from admitting. They know blame is unfair. That their emotional unavailability is not indication. They feel nothing but is shield preventing them from feeling everything they would have to feel if they admitted what pride prevents admitting. The things unsaid are not unknown but are too threatening to pride to be spoken, too dangerous to defensive system to be acknowledged, too painful to face when facing would require changing or seeking help or taking responsibility rather than continuing patterns that hurt you while protecting them from vulnerability, accountability would require. The truth is, they know they hurt you and they know patterns are the problem, and they know you deserved better, and they know they should change, but knowing does not translate into doing when pride prevents admission that would make change necessary. What they would say if not too proud reveals gap between knowing and doing, between awareness and accountability, between understanding patterns hurt people and being willing to address patterns, rather than defending patterns by blaming people patterns hurt. The admissions that pride prevents are admissions that would require them to face their terror, rather than protecting terror through continuing defensive patterns that maintain terror's power over their capacity for intimacy. Number 1, they would admit they know they hurt you more than you hurt them. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that they know they hurt you more than you hurt them, that damage was not mutual or equal or reciprocal, but was primarily caused by their patterns, while your hurt was caused by their hurting you rather than by you hurting them in ways comparable to how they hurt you. They would confess that they know your responses to their withdrawal were reactions to their patterns, rather than attacks requiring their defensive withdrawal, that your expressing needs was attempt to get needs met, rather than excessive demands justifying their distancing, that your hurt about their treatment was appropriate pain, rather than oversensitivity warranting their minimization. They would acknowledge that framing relationship as mutually damaging was defense against facing that they were person doing most of damage, that claiming you hurt them too was deflection from accountability for hurt they caused, that positioning dynamic as both people equally responsible was protection from admitting their terror, and defensive patterns created most of pain, while your pain created defensive responses they then used as evidence you were equally problematic. The mutual damage narrative serves their pride by diffusing responsibility, by making hurt seem inevitable rather than caused by their specific patterns, by allowing them to avoid facing that they were person who withdrew and blamed and criticized, and created distance that destroyed intimacy you were trying to preserve. The admission they know they hurt you more than you hurt them would require facing that they were problem in relationship in ways you were not problem. that their wounds caused damage in ways your wounds did not cause damage. That leaving you was not escape from mutual toxicity, but was their choosing to protect patterns rather than address patterns that hurt you. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging they failed you, that their love was insufficient, that patterns they employed to protect themselves actually hurt someone who loved them. That defensive system that makes them feel safe creates unsafe situations for people trying to love them. But they know. They know you gave more than they gave. They know you tried harder than they tried. They know you accommodated their limitations while they punished your needs. They know you stayed longer than you should have stayed while they left earlier than necessary. They know the hurt was not equal, even though pride requires them to claim equality to protect themselves from facing. That inequality reveals their patterns as problem, rather than relationship as problem or you as problem. The knowing exists behind the defensiveness, even when defensiveness prevents knowing from becoming admission that would require accountability. Number 2, they would admit you loved them better than they deserved, and better than they could reciprocate. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that you loved them better than they deserved to be loved, given how they treated you, better than their patterns warranted, given how patterns prevented reciprocation, better than they could reciprocate. Given that terror made reciprocating your level of love feel impossible or dangerous or depleting. They would confess that your love was extraordinary rather than ordinary, was more patient and understanding and accommodating than most people would have provided, was commitment to them despite their patterns rather than because their behavior earned such commitment. They would acknowledge that they did not deserve your patience when they kept withdrawing after you kept pursuing, did not deserve your understanding when they blamed you for their defensive reactions, did not deserve your accommodation when they never accommodated your needs in comparable ways. They would admit that someone loving them the way you loved them was a rare gift they should have treasured, but instead took for granted, should have protected, but instead damaged through continued patterns, should have reciprocated, but instead accepted while giving minimal investment back. Subscribe to. Discover what the avoidant would tell you right now if their pride did not prevent them from admitting truths. Their defensive patterns require them to hide behind blame and minimization and emotional unavailability. The admission you loved them better than they could reciprocate would require facing that inability to reciprocate was their limitation, rather than your excessive expectation. That gap between your giving and their giving was their inadequacy rather than your demanding too much. That your love being more than they could match revealed their wounds preventing reciprocation rather than your love being inappropriately intense. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging they were insufficient partner, that someone gave them everything while they gave back almost nothing, that person who loved them well enough to stay, despite their patterns deserved partner who could reciprocate that love, and they were not that partner. But they know. They know you loved them in ways they could never love you back. They know your investment exceeded theirs by margins that shame would force them to confront if pride did not prevent confrontation. They know that losing someone who loved them that well is loss. They will recognize more fully as years pass, and they discover most people will not tolerate patterns you tolerated, will not give chances you gave, will not stay as long as you stayed. The knowing exists behind the pride, even when pride prevents knowing from becoming gratitude or changed behavior or acknowledgement that you deserved better than what terror allowed them to provide. Number 3, they would admit their patterns are the problem, not your reactions to their patterns. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that their patterns are actual problem. In relationship dynamics, rather than your reactions to patterns being problem, that you're pursuing when they withdrew was response to their withdrawal rather than cause of withdrawal. That you're expressing needs was attempt to get needs met rather than excessive demands that justified their distancing, that your hurt about their behavior was appropriate pain rather than overreaction, warranting their minimization. They would confess that blaming you for reacting to their patterns was deflection from facing that. Patterns created reactions, was defense against accountability for initiating cycles through withdrawal that prompted your pursuit. They would acknowledge that claiming you were too needy was easier than facing they were too distant, that framing your standards as too high was simpler than admitting they could not meet reasonable standards, that positioning your responses as excessive was more comfortable than recognizing responses were proportional to patterns that hurt you. They would admit that pursuing distancing dynamic started with their distancing rather than with your pursuing, that criticism cycles began with their blame rather than with your defensiveness, that emotional disconnection originated with their unavailability rather than with your demands for availability. The admission their patterns are a problem would require facing that changing relationship would require them changing patterns rather than you accepting patterns. That fixing dynamic would mean them addressing terror rather than you managing terror better. That relationship working would necessitate them doing therapeutic work rather than you accommodating dysfunction more skillfully. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging need for help, recognizing patterns as dysfunctional rather than as reasonable self-protection, accepting that their wounds hurt people rather than their wounds being neutral differences in attachment style that partners should accommodate. But they know their withdrawal prompted your pursuit rather than your pursuit causing their withdrawal. They know their unavailability created your needs feeling unmet rather than your needs being inherently excessive. They know their patterns initiated damage, even though they positioned your reactions as initiating damage to deflect from their patterns being root cause. The knowing exists behind the blame, even when blame prevents knowing from becoming accountability or motivation to address patterns or recognition that patterns rather than partners are a consistent problem across their relationships. Number 4. They would admit they sabotaged something good because fear felt safer than intimacy. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that they sabotaged relationship that was actually good for them, destroyed connection that met needs they claimed no one could meet, pushed away person who provided exactly what they said they wanted, while terror made having what they wanted feel more dangerous than continuing to want without having. They would confess that sabotage was deliberate choice, even if choice felt compulsive, was active destruction, even if destruction was implemented through passive withdrawal, was choosing fear over love because fear felt familiar, while love felt threatening to defensive system, built to protect from intimacy. They would acknowledge that relationship did not fail because compatibility was absent, but failed because their terror prevented them from tolerating compatibility, when compatibility created intimacy that activated fear. That connection did not end because you were wrong for them, but ended because you were right for them in ways that made rightness feel dangerous. That intimacy did not erode naturally, but was systematically destroyed through defensive patterns. Triggered by intimacy reaching depths where being known felt like being trapped. They would admit that they created problems that did not exist organically, manufactured conflicts that justified withdrawal, found reasons to distance when real reason was that closeness activated terror. The admission they sabotaged something good would require facing that they destroyed relationship worth preserving to protect patterns worth addressing, that they chose terror over love when love was available and terror was optional if they did therapeutic work, that they pushed away someone good for them because good for them felt threatening to wounds that made good things feel dangerous. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging they are obstacle to their own happiness, that patterns they employ for protection actually prevent them from having what they claim to want. That person they lost through sabotage was loss they caused rather than loss that happened to them. But they know They know relationship was better than most relationships they will have. They know you were better partner than most partners they will find. They know they manufactured distance in situations where closeness was available if terror had not made closeness intolerable. They know sabotage was their choice, even if choice was driven by compulsion. No destruction was their doing, even if doing felt like automatic defensive response. The knowing exists behind the defensiveness, even when defensiveness prevents knowing from becoming recognition. That sabotaging good things to maintain bad patterns is tragedy. They authored rather than misfortune. They suffered. Number 5. They would admit they see you moving on, and it terrifies them in ways they cannot show. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that they see you moving on without them, and the seeing terrifies them in ways their defensive patterns prevent them from showing. That watching you rebuild life that does not include them activates panic. Their pride cannot permit them to express. That recognizing you will eventually love someone new creates fear. Their wounds make impossible to acknowledge, out loud or even fully to themselves. They would confess that their appearing unaffected by your absence is performance rather than truth, is defense against vulnerability rather than evidence of indifference, is protection from admitting they need you in ways that need feels like weakness their pride cannot tolerate revealing. They would acknowledge that your strength in leaving created terror. They did not feel during relationship when your staying made their patterns feel consequence-free, that your moving forward demonstrated you will survive without them. When defensive system relied on believing you needed them more than they needed you, that you're recovering from damage they caused proves you were stronger than they positioned you as, during times they criticized your responses to their patterns. They would admit that part of them hopes you will return, even while another part knows they cannot give you what return would require, wants you to stay stuck on them even while recognizing stuck would be unhealthy for you. The admission they are terrified of you moving on would require facing that losing you matters more than pride allowed them to show during relationship. That your absence creates void their defensive patterns cannot fill. That you moving on means they lost something irreplaceable rather than just someone who was too much or too needy or too demanding. The pride prevents this admission because admission would mean showing vulnerability they spent relationship avoiding, acknowledging dependence they claimed not to feel, expressing need. Their patterns existed to prevent expressing. But they know. They know you moving on means losing you permanently, when relationship ending felt temporary. They know your building new life means space for them disappearing when they assumed space would remain available indefinitely. They know your healing from them means they no longer occupy position in your heart that pride prevented them from acknowledging they wanted to occupy. The knowing exists behind the apparent indifference, even when indifference is performance, protecting them from facing that they care more than they can admit, without threatening defensive system that requires appearing not to care. Number 6. They would admit they are repeating patterns that keep them alone and they do not know how to stop. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that they recognize they are repeating same patterns across relationships, that each relationship ends the same way for same reasons, caused by same terror, creating same withdrawal, creating same damage, that they are common factor in pattern of failed intimacy, rather than being unlucky in partners who happen to all be too needy or too demanding or too much. They would confess that awareness they are repeating patterns coexists with feeling powerless to stop patterns. That knowing patterns hurt people does not translate into changing patterns when changing feels impossible or terrifying, or like losing essential protection. They would acknowledge that each new relationship starts with hope. This time will be different. That different partner will not trigger terror, or that terror has somehow resolved without them addressing terror. That patterns will not emerge when patterns always emerge because patterns are not about partners, but about their wounds determining how they respond when intimacy reaches depths that activate defense. They would admit that failure to stop repeating patterns despite knowing patterns keep them alone, reveals that conscious knowledge of problem is insufficient without addressing terror and wounds that generate patterns as automatic protective responses. The admission they are repeating patterns and do not know how to stop would require facing that patterns are not conscious choices. They can simply decide to stop, but are compulsive responses, requiring therapeutic intervention. That wanting to stop is insufficient when terror makes stopping feel like removing protection they believe they need. That continuing patterns while hoping patterns will spontaneously resolve is maintaining problem while avoiding solution. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging they need help. They cannot provide themselves. That patterns are bigger than their conscious control. That continuing to date while unwilling to address patterns that destroy relationships is setting up inevitable failure while hoping for impossible success. But they know current relationship will end like previous relationships ended. They know next partner will eventually seem too needy just like you seemed too needy, and person before you seemed too needy. They know withdrawal will happen again, and blame will be projected again, and intimacy will be sabotaged again. Because patterns repeat regardless of partner, when patterns are about their terror, rather than about partner's behavior. The knowing exists behind the hope, even when hope maintains trying same approach while expecting different results that patterns guarantee will not occur. Number 7. They would admit you were right to leave, and they know they will regret losing you. The avoidant would admit, if not too proud, that you were right to leave relationship where their patterns prevented them from meeting your needs. That staying would have required continued self-abandonment that would have damaged you further. That choosing yourself was correct choice, even though their pride required them to frame leaving as you giving up, or you being impatient, or you not understanding their limitations. They would confess that they know. They will regret losing you as time reveals how rare your patience was, how extraordinary your accommodation was, how unlikely finding someone else who tolerates their patterns as long as you tolerated patterns. They would acknowledge that regret will intensify as they cycle through relationships that end more quickly because other people have less patience, as they encounter partners who demand more and accommodate less, as they recognize that you staying as long as you stayed was exceptional rather than standard. They can expect from others. They would admit that future relationships will make them miss relationship with you, not because future partners are worse, but because future partners will not tolerate patterns you tolerated, will leave sooner when patterns emerge, will require them to choose between patterns and relationship in ways you did not require until you absolutely had to require. After giving chances most people would never give. The admission you were right to leave would require facing that losing you was consequence of their patterns, rather than consequence of your inadequacy. That your leaving was protecting yourself, rather than giving up on relationship. That their losing someone who loved them well is loss. That proves patterns cost them something valuable, rather than patterns being neutral self-protection that partners should simply accept. The pride prevents this admission, because admission would mean acknowledging they drove away someone worth keeping, that patterns they defend as reasonable self-protection actually prevent them from keeping people who love them. That you leaving was rational response to their dysfunction, rather than emotional overreaction to their reasonable boundaries. But they know. They know you were right to leave. They know staying longer would have damaged you more without changing their patterns. They know they will regret losing you when subsequent relationships make clear how much you gave that others will not give. They know that years from now, they will think about you and recognize you were a person who loved them best, even if their terror prevented them from loving you back the way you deserved. The knowing exists behind the defensiveness, even when defensiveness maintains they are fine without you. Maintains losing you was mutual choice rather than consequence of their patterns. Maintains they will easily find someone else when they know finding someone who gives what you gave is unlikely. Why these admissions will never come? Because pride protects patterns more than truth protects people. These admissions will never actually come from the avoidant, because their pride protects patterns more than truth protects people. Because maintaining defensive narratives feels safer than facing truths that would require change. Because acknowledging what pride prevents admitting would obligate them to address patterns when addressing patterns feels more threatening than continuing patterns, despite recognizing patterns hurt people they claim to care about. The pride is not vanity, but is final defense against facing terror, is protection from vulnerability accountability would require, is barrier preventing recognition that would make continuing patterns while claiming to want intimacy impossible to maintain. The admissions would create cognitive dissonance between knowing patterns hurt people and continuing patterns without addressing patterns, would force choice between defending patterns and taking responsibility for damage patterns cause, would require either changing or accepting. They choose not to change when changing is possible through therapeutic work they refuse to do. The pride resolves dissonance by preventing admissions, by maintaining narratives where they are not problem, or where problem is mutual, or where patterns are reasonable rather than dysfunctional. The protection pride provides is protection from facing themselves honestly, from seeing their wounds clearly, from recognizing that defensive system meant to protect them actually isolates them while hurting people who try to love them. Understanding pride prevents admissions, reveals that waiting for them to acknowledge these truths is waiting for something that will not happen, that hoping they will eventually admit. What pride prevents admitting is hoping for breakthrough that threatens defensive system. They will protect more fiercely than they will protect relationship with you. The admissions require vulnerability. Their wounds make feel dangerous. The pride protects from that danger. The protection continues even when protection costs them relationships worth having. Pride wins over truth. Patterns win over people. Defense wins over connection. The admissions remain unspoken, not because they are unknown, but because speaking them threatens pride that protects patterns that keep them defended and alone. How? Knowing they know, but will not admit changes how you process the relationship. Knowing that the avoidant knows these truths but will not admit them changes how you process relationship and your role in relationships ending. Because recognizing they know means releasing yourself from belief. You failed to make them understand, from sense that if you had just explained better or loved better or stayed longer eventually, they would have seen truth. They see truth. They know truth. The problem is not that they do not understand, but that pride prevents admitting understanding. That awareness exists behind defensiveness, even when defensiveness prevents awareness from becoming accountability. The knowing they know protects you from personalizing their blame, because their blaming you was deflection from truths they knew but could not admit. Rather than genuine belief, you were problem. Was defense against facing their patterns rather than accurate assessment of your behavior. Was projection serving their pride rather than perception reflecting reality. When they said you were too needy, they knew you had normal needs they could not meet. When they said you were too demanding, they knew you had reasonable standards they could not satisfy. When they said you were overreacting, they knew your reactions were appropriate to their patterns. The blame was not belief, but was protection from admission, that pride made impossible. Understanding this prevents you from carrying their projections as truth about yourself, from internalizing criticism that was defensive distortion rather than accurate feedback, from believing narratives they constructed to protect pride, rather than narratives reflecting who you actually are. You were not too much. They knew you were not too much, even while claiming you were too much to justify their patterns. You were not the problem. They knew their patterns were problem, even while blaming you to avoid facing patterns. You were not an adequate partner. They knew you were extraordinary partner, whose extraordinariness their terror prevented them from reciprocating. Stop carrying blame they gave you. Knowing blame was unfair. They know truth even when pride prevents admitting truth. Why recognizing their self-awareness behind defensiveness matters for your healing. Recognizing the avoidant's self-awareness behind their defensiveness matters for your healing, because understanding they know what they did shifts narrative from you failed to make them see. 2. They saw but chose not to change. From you were not enough to they knew you were more than enough, but terror prevented them from receiving what you offered. From maybe I was the problem to they knew I was not problem, even while positioning me as problem to protect their patterns. The shift in narrative protects your self-perception, validates your experience, confirms your reality against defensive distortions they employed. The recognition also releases you from hope that eventually they will understand if you just wait long enough, explain clearly enough, love persistently enough. They understand now. Understanding more later will not change that pride prevents admission. That awareness does not translate into accountability when defensive system protects patterns more than truth protects people. That knowing they hurt you does not mean they will apologize or change or seek help when knowing coexists with pride, preventing actions knowing should motivate. Release hope they will eventually see. They see. They just will not admit seeing, because admission threatens pride that protects patterns. Understanding their awareness also validates anger you might feel about being hurt by someone who knew they were hurting you, who recognized patterns were problem while blaming you for patterns, who understood you deserved better while giving you worse. The hurt feels different when you recognize they knew versus when you believe they did not know. Being hurt by someone operating unconsciously feels like tragedy. Being hurt by someone who knew but chose pattern protection over relationship preservation feels like betrayal. Your anger about betrayal is valid. They knew. They chose patterns over you while knowing you deserved better. The anger protects you from minimizing damage, from excusing behavior that cannot be excused by ignorance they did not have. How they're knowing but not admitting reveals the depth of their woundedness. The avoidant knowing these truths but being too proud to admit them reveals how deeply wounded they are. How thoroughly terror controls their capacity for vulnerability. How completely defensive system has overtaken authentic relating. The knowing without admitting demonstrates that wounds are not just about fear of intimacy, but about inability to tolerate vulnerability admission would require. Not just about attachment issues, but about pride protecting patterns at cost of truth and connection and relationship. The gap between knowing and admitting shows that therapeutic work they need is extensive rather than surface level, addresses not just conscious patterns, but unconscious defenses, operating to prevent consciousness from generating accountability, targets not just behaviors, but entire system of protection, preventing behaviors from changing. Despite awareness, behaviors hurt people. Someone who knows they hurt you, but cannot admit knowing, is someone whose wounds run deeper than someone who hurts you without recognizing hurt, whose pride is more rigid than someone who can acknowledge impact, whose defensive system is more entrenched than someone who responds to awareness with change. Understanding depth of woundedness. This reveals protects you from believing you could have saved them, from thinking your love could have healed wounds this deep, from carrying responsibility for relationship ending, when relationship ended, because wounds prevented them from sustaining intimacy regardless of how well you loved them. You could not have loved them healed. Wounds this deep require professional intervention over years. Your leaving was protecting yourself from damage patterns, caused not abandoning them to suffer alone. They chose pattern protection over seeking help. That choice is theirs, not yours. The wounds are deep, but depth does not obligate you to stay wounded alongside them. What it means that they will think of you years from now and finally admit. Truths. Pride prevents now. Years from now, the avoidant will think of you and might finally admit to themselves, if not to you, truths that pride prevents admitting now, might recognize in retrospect that you were a person who loved them best, even if terror prevented them from loving you back, might understand that losing you is losing something they will not find again. Because subsequent relationships will make clear how exceptional your patience and accommodation and commitment were. The future admission comes too late to save relationship, but might come eventually when distance creates safety. Pride requires to acknowledge truths, too threatening to admit, when truths could obligate action. The eventual recognition you were right and you deserved better, and they sabotaged something good will not benefit you because you will have moved on, will have healed from damage they caused, will have built life that no longer includes space for them, or hope they will change, or wish they would admit truths. The admission comes when admission no longer matters to you, even though admission might matter to them. As they recognize patterns they defended, cost them relationships worth having. You do not need their eventual admission. You already know what they know, but will not admit. Your knowing is sufficient. Their admission years later changes nothing. Understanding they will eventually recognize what pride prevents recognizing. Now protects you from waiting for recognition that comes too late. From hoping eventual admission will provide closure when closure comes from accepting. They will not admit while admission would matter. From believing their future regret compensates for current damage when regret changes nothing about past hurt. They will regret losing you. The regret will not undo damage. They will recognize you were right. The recognition will not restore relationship. They will admit they knew even while denying. The admission will not reach you because you will be long gone. Building life with someone whose pride allows admission, whose wounds allow vulnerability, whose patterns allow sustained intimacy you deserved all along. The distant future when they finally face what pride prevents facing now is future where you no longer need their facing anything, where their recognition serves only them as they process patterns that cost them you, where their admission is private acknowledgement rather than communication to you. By the time they can admit they knew you deserved better, you will be with someone who demonstrates daily that you deserve better, rather than merely admitting years too late what pride prevented admitting when admission might have motivated change. Their knowing now, but admitting later, changes nothing. Your knowing now that they know is what frees you to stop waiting for admission that comes too late to matter. The ultimate truth about what they would say if not too proud to admit it. The ultimate truth is that the avoidant knows much more than their behavior suggests they know, understands more than their patterns demonstrate they understand, recognizes more than their defensiveness, allows them to acknowledge, out loud or even fully to themselves. They know they hurt you more than you hurt them. They know you loved them, better than they deserved and better than they could reciprocate. They know their patterns are the problem, not your reactions to patterns. They know they sabotaged something good because fear felt safer than intimacy. They know they see you moving on, and it terrifies them in ways they cannot show. They know they are repeating patterns that keep them alone and do not know how to stop. They know you were right to leave, and they know they will regret losing you. But knowing does not translate into admitting when pride prevents admission. Understanding does not become accountability when pride protects patterns. Recognition does not generate change when pride defends against vulnerability change would require. The things they would say if not too proud to admit, it remain unsaid because pride is stronger than truth, because protecting defensive system feels more urgent than protecting relationship, because avoiding vulnerability seems safer than facing terror, even when facing terror is only path to healing that would allow them to sustain intimacy they claim to want. The admissions will never come. The pride will never yield. The patterns will continue protecting while hurting. And you will never hear what they would say if they were not too proud to admit it. But you can know that behind the defensiveness and blame and minimization exists some level of awareness that they hurt you, that you deserved better, that patterns are a problem, that they sabotaged relationship worth having. The awareness just never translates into admission or accountability or change because pride makes admission feel like weakness, accountability feel like exposure, change feel like losing protection. That wounds insist they need. Stop waiting for admissions that will not come. Stop hoping pride will yield to truth. Stop believing eventually they will acknowledge what pride prevents acknowledging. Accept that knowing and admitting are different, that awareness and accountability are separate, that recognizing patterns hurt people and addressing patterns are distinct choices they will not make, while pride protects patterns more than truth protects people. The things they would say, if not too proud, reveal what they know, but will never admit. The things unsaid are not unknown, but are too threatening to pride to ever become admissions you hear. Let go of waiting for words that will not come. Protect yourself from relationship with someone who knows they hurt you, but whose pride prevents them from ever actually saying they know, or changing patterns that hurt, or seeking help. That might allow them to love, without terror, making love feel dangerous. You deserved a partner whose pride allowed vulnerability, whose wounds allowed healing, whose patterns allowed love to deepen rather than love to destroy. They were not that partner. They knew they were not that partner even while blaming you for their inadequacy. Their knowing but not admitting is their loss and your release. Release yourself from waiting for admission. They know. That knowledge trapped inside pride changes nothing for you but reveals everything about why relationship could not work regardless of how well you loved them. Move forward without waiting for words that pride will never allow them to speak. You deserve someone whose honesty matches their awareness, whose pride permits vulnerability, whose wounds permit love. That person exists. Find them.